On today's Locked On Bucks, we continue our look at the offseason, part 2 of the conversation between myself, Camille, and Van from Brew Hoop, and it comes your way next.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. And today, once again, by Van Fayaz from brewhoop.com as we continue our look ahead to the draft and the offseason for the Milwaukee Bucks. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right, we continue the conversation and look ahead to tomorrow's draft and the offseason as a whole with Van Fayaz of brewhoop.com on Locked On Bucks. The Lopez one is interesting because I think we've all kind of aligned on it's easy to talk. I think it's the last piece that we touched on when you look at where the contracts are. That's the easier one to cobble together trades and say, well, you could send this out and bring this back. My
multiple players,
reservation is, and multiple, again, is just how do you replace him on the court? Because you're not bringing back a center for Brook Lopez in a trade. We've seen names, and Camille and I, we talked about Kelly Ware in the draft last week, and maybe the Bucks get him in the first round, but that's a pretty big ask to say this guy who had some questions about his motor in college, he's going to step in and be the Brook Lopez replacement. I know that, we've talked about 5 out and the league is different. And even the argument, because I've pointed out what you said at the top there, Van, a number of times, is I just don't know that you want Giannis at the 5 in the regular season. You're fine with the playoffs. You don't want to put the wear and tear on him. And I've seen people push back, and there is some truth to it of it's not as much wear and tear as you think, because it's not as though he's facing a ton of post-up centers. But the point is, okay, but you still have 2 games against Nikola Jokic. You still have 3 to 4 games against Joel Embiid. You have the Minnesota Timberwolves 2 times on your schedule. So there's a lot of size that's been accumulated in the league. You still need some of that to combat that. And I guess the other piece of it that we didn't touch on is, we've mentioned Brook Lopez being an expiring contract. Mm-hmm. And we had this conversation a lot with Chris Middleton of, look, it's not as simple as just let him go and then you can sign somebody else because of the cap constraints that you're up against. It's not a great spot. It does get a little different next year, though, with the cap. Next year is when it starts to really go up 10% projected every single year. And taking off that $20 million from Brook Lopez, are you going to be under the cap? Probably not, unless something else happens. But are you going to have other things to use to fill that out, like a taxpayer mid-level and other things that you could use? Yeah, so that's where it does start to get interesting.
There are a bunch of option decisions next summer too. Chris Middleton and Bobby Portis with player options. And that's when the new deals for both Giannis and Damian Lillard kick in. The extension actually that Dame Lillard signed with Portland will kick in for that year. They have right now guaranteed salary on the books for 25-26, $173 million. The apron and the tax are going up quite a bit. That's actually under the tax
or something. Yeah.
Luxury tax for following year projected right now, about 188. Second apron, about 20 million more than that. I think flexibility wise, it's going to be very tough to get to cap room, but let's say, first of all, let's say any of these guys decline their player option. I think the most likely one would be Bobby Portis. And if he's still on the team, then he, just like Lopez, is going to have a big cap hold on the books, which does, allow you to make some moves that would take you over the salary cap because, some of that 173 million I'm talking about is coming off the books. They drop below the salary cap, but you keep those holds on the books. That allows you to re-sign each of those guys, potentially for something cheaper, which is, I think, what you do with Brook Lopez if he stuck around, while also giving you a bunch of flexibility, like maybe the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, for example, to add something next summer. So there is some value, in keeping Brook Lopez on the roster next offseason, because it gives you some neat possibilities as far as building out the roster with, these exceptions.
And even real quick here, Camille, even theoretically, Chris, too, when we talk about that player option, I suppose that's which would you prefer? We assume he's going to pick it up, or what if he declines it and you work out another, okay, give us a little back and we'll give you an additional year and a player option on there. But then again, you're getting into the conversation of, man, you're really kicking this thing down the road. If Chris Middleton is going to be going into, at that point, what is his 34 or 35 age season, and talking about adding on additional years. I also believe I would have to look at the actual date of birth, but then you're getting close to you can only give him X amount of years because Chris Paul is no longer around to look out for his guys and say, let's just make this the over 40 rule and not the over 35 rule.
It's over 38 right now. Isn't that what it is?
You're right. It's 38. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So not quite there yet, but for Lopez, it would be. I don't think that'd be an issue for Brook Lopez, though. So I'm sure. Go ahead.
Let me ask you this, Van, because I'm going to kind of steer us in a different direction really quick. I'm thinking of something you said earlier when you mentioned just how the salary cap works, how you have these holds on your books, so on and so forth. And you mentioned the Bucks' first round draft pick and what that salary slot is at the moment. We've been having these conversations throughout this show as well about possible trade options, and so on and so forth, but mostly around, Brook Lopez, Bobby Portis, Pat Connaughton. When it comes to the Bucks draft, which is a few days away now, and they have this first round draft pick as well as the second round draft pick, which I think the second round draft pick is going to be really valuable for the Bucks. And given that this is the first year with this 2-day draft, I'm really curious to see, like, after day one ends and you see who's on the board, if there's a lot of action with trading those second round picks with teams looking to get back on the board. But thinking of the Bucks' flexibility and just options that they have, if you had to trade one of the 2 draft picks that the Bucks have, would you be more inclined to look to try to get off of that first rounder or that second rounder, and why? What would be the reasoning behind that, especially cap wise?
First of all, I think it's important to note that because of what's colloquially known as the Stepien rule, the Bucks cannot trade this pick until basically after it's made. Right. Because right now they don't have a draft pick for next year. It was traded out. I think that one was still in the Lopez deal. And that's just what it's going to be in even numbered years moving forward. The Bucks aren't going to have a pick until after 2030 in an even numbered year. And the odd numbered years they'll have picks, just they can't trade them because they're encumbered by the swaps. Right. So if they want to, they could work something out with a team and draft a player for them at 23 in the coming days. But nothing could be finalized until after the draft, just because you can't violate that rule. But I would prefer, personally, I think I was kind of hoping that they would move that second round pick at the deadline this year, because that was part of the infamous Serge Ibaka, Dante DiVincenzo trade. They, for what that didn't provide on court, it did provide the Bucks with at least 2, I think it was 3 second round picks.
It basically got you, which
a couple of them were sent out for Jay Crowder.
Right. I was going to say, didn't yield the results you wanted, but it basically got you Jay Crowder and then this. Yeah.
So this one, it was starting to look like, especially last offseason, hey, that's gonna be pretty valuable. Really good, and I thought, had they been willing to move that at the deadline alongside, like, if they had packaged that with MarJon Beauchamp, I think that's just as good as a first round pick. And I think, it might be the same this year just because it's just barely out of the first round. It's like, if you put that together with another young player, it's almost like you're trading a late first round pick this year. Now I mentioned earlier, if you wanted to just trade out Pat Connaughton, get that salary relief, like not take any money back for him. And if you did, you have a lot of this flexibility I've been talking about. But you're going to have to probably trade that pick, if not the first round pick. And I don't think I would just dump off this first round pick, given the way that the team is, for just getting off of 2 more years of Pat Connaughton and getting you under the luxury tax so you can sign someone to a mid-level, whatever. But the other thing, and I know you two have talked about this, is there are a bunch of young players on this roster next year.
Yep.
There are guys you want to develop. Like, if you're the Bucks, you want to see what you have with Green, the AJs, Green and Jackson. They both showed a lot of promise this year. Look like they could be rotation players on a good team. Marjon Beauchamp, I wouldn't say that about. I'm much less sold on him. And then you have Chris Livingston too. I know is your guy, Justin, who is like a total lottery ticket, I would say. But that is, I wrote about this recently too. That's 4 guys. Adding 2 more guys to that core of young players is going to take away minutes from somebody. And you also are trying to win games. This whole, I mean, we saw that the 2 timeline thing in Golden State was, I would say a bit of
fallacy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I was going to say Pyrrhic, which I think that's what that's what fool's gold, pyrite. I think they have the same root in Latin or whatever. But anyway, I think, yeah, if you would want to carry at most, I would say, at most 5. I would prefer to keep that group of young guys at 4. And I would just, if it were me, I would keep the AJs. I would keep the first round pick, and then one of Beauchamp or Livingston. And I would use whichever one of them and that second round pick. I think, sending those 2 out as sweeteners in a trade once you get below that second apron, if they get below that second apron, and they could aggregate something together. Yeah, I think that might be that might be what I would do, at least in regards to the picks.
Well, I love sports. I love them so much. I never want sports to stop. But as the playoffs are winding down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sporting like we want them to. But FanDuel keeps me with sports going whenever I want them. All I have to do is open the app and dream up any bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. I assume I know your answer to this because it seems rather obvious, but we haven't touched on any of the free agents that the Bucks have. We mentioned one name. I think everybody is kind of aligned. Camille and I a couple weeks ago talked about, I don't know, do you maybe bring back Malik if you can get him on the vet minimum again? And as we've seen, doesn't appear to be the case. Our thought, I see the face, was more of like, well, you got to be more judicious in the minutes and lineups that you play him in. We know he can't start next to Damian Lillard. So is he just your scorer off the bench? But that seems like it's irrelevant. Pat Beverly is really the only other name worth having the conversation on since the injury occurred to Thanasis. Do you think Pat Beverly is on the team next year?
Well, I remember soon after he came to the Bucks after the deadline, I was covering their game at the United Center. And it was a pretty funny interview we had with Pat Connaughton afterwards in the locker room. He did ask us at the end if we subscribed to the pod, but he let us talk to he let us talk to him first for a while, and he actually gave some kind of funny answers. And there's quite a bond between him, Pat Bev, and Doc Rivers, which I think a lot of fans know. The way that Beverly put it was, we've been working together for years, basically. Like we have this kind of understanding. He yells at me more than any other coach I've ever had, and I think he yells at me more than any other player he's ever had. So I think of the Bucks free agents, he's the most likely to come back. But I've had this conversation with others as well. Let's say the Bucks are bringing in another ball handler or just someone in the backcourt who could take minutes away from him, even if they're more, like, not even a combo guy, just someone on the wing, like, who's playing the two. Does Pat Beverly want to come back? I know he said he might be looking for a little bit of a raise in the offseason, which I don't know. I mean, Joe Ingles got like $10 million last year. So he might be able to get a little bit more. And in that case, the Bucks can't do that without they can't bring it back on more than the vet min, really, or just a small raise on it, unless they get into that exception, which, again, gotta get below the second apron. So I think if the Bucks are able to, do some of that, if they're able to go through all these steps we've been talking about, and let's say they sign someone with the mid-level or a minimum, there are names I really like for the Bucks in the backcourt. Chris Dunn would be sensational to get. I don't think he'll come on the mid-level or on a minimum, but I think he'll get the mid-level wherever he goes, that taxpayer mid-level. Monte Morris, who had kind of a lost season last year, but is a really was when he was healthy with Denver and it was Washington his previous year, was a really great floor general, guy who doesn't turn the ball over and passes the ball really well. There's some other names out there too who are a little bit less sexy. Dennis Smith Jr., DeLon Wright, good defenders. But so I think if any of those guys were to come to the Bucks, then maybe it would cause Pat Beverly to, take a second and think, well, maybe I want to go somewhere else where I can get a little more playing time.
Well, and not to mention all those names that you listed are at the very least 6 years younger than Pat Beverly. I think Chris Dunn was the oldest of the group, and he's going to turn 31.
He's 30. DeLon Wright's 32, but yeah. So you're shaving years off of there as well, which is the other important piece that we talked about. Going back to the bigs piece and what you mentioned before too, of, again, I would view this as more of a, I suppose, pie in the sky, and it also relates to or comes back to how do you actually view this player. But we've seen or heard, I should say, more and more rumblings, which is not surprising given how Danny Ainge conducts business, that the Jazz have said, I don't think Walker Kessler's really our guy. We're listening to offers on him. His salary is enough to send out, even, granted, you could technically do this. It would take more, but when you talk about Marjan Beauchamp and a draft pick as a sweetener, that would match under what Walker Kessler is getting paid, and you would then have to pay him next season when he would theoretically replace Brook Lopez. Not a bad suggestion. He was a bit of a divisive prospect.
Very good his rookie year and not so much last year.
Yeah, and what Utah has done with him, I find a little strange. Sensational rookie season, and then what do? They go out and acquire John Collins, who that's another name that would be an interesting fit with the Bucks, but that's a really hard one to work, and also has some real drawbacks. But with Kessler, I remember Mitchell Maurer, my predecessor, who has been on this pod many times, he was very anti-Walker Kessler when that draft was coming in, and I was just curious to see how he would do in the league, because he's he's the type of player that you see coming in the league right now, and you don't think will be all that successful because he doesn't have an outside shot. You're probably looking at him a lot like you look at Zach Edey this year. Who similar kind of discourse right now going into the draft about whether or not you want him on your team. But Kessler, I mean, you could sell me on that right now. I think the defense is real. The rim protection is great. It's just a matter of, bringing in another non-shooter in that front court with Giannis, non-floor spacer. You have to find a way to do it. I think, that's going to involve a lot of people in the dunker spot, which of course Bud would do from time to time. That's just a name it's the same kind of problem you'd have with like Steven Adams or Jared Allen, what we were talking about earlier.
And then too, if the Bucks are looking to play a more versatile defensive scheme, it's like, does Walker Kessler help you do that exactly, or are you going to have to continue doing that drop coverage with him out there on the floor as well? So
yeah, these guys aren't very switchable, are they?
right. And it's like, if you're getting rid of Brook for more versatility, like why would you go and get Brook Lopez light? They cannot shoot as well. So that's something I think about too with the reports that have come out so far this offseason. Like, what exactly are the Bucks looking to do with that center spot? Is Giannis more open this year going, like now that he's getting, is he more open to playing center? Because if that answer is yes, I do think that changes some of the conversations that we're having, because I'm assuming we're all operating out of the sense of what we've heard before, which is Giannis does not want to play the 5. That's how I'm operating, and I will continue to do so until I hear different. So it's something to think about too when people are throwing out names. Like, if the Bucks are looking to be more versatile defensively, then the center that they're bringing in would have to be able to do a bit more defensively than what Brook Lopez did, which is be excellent in that drop coverage.
Yeah, and to that end, one of the things I learned about bringing in Ibaka, and not to dwell on this too much, but just in the past, thinking about other centers, especially in that year that Brook Lopez was, missed most of the season with the back surgery, is just that to do what Brook Lopez does in the drop defense, that's not easy. For years, I would always think, there are other centers out there who could do it. I always looked at Miles Turner. You guys, centers who are big, quality rim protectors, long, ones who are younger than Lopez and maybe a little bit lighter, but could kind of fill that role when the time came for Brook Lopez to move on. But Ibaka, had a great career prior to the his back injury as a defender. You remember him in Toronto, and I think he was on an all defense team at one point. He, of course, not prime Serge Ibaka, but he couldn't do what Brook Lopez was doing, and he's someone you looked at as like, he's maybe a little bit more mobile than Lopez. I don't think just anyone can execute in that drop scheme.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just take a really good center on one team and necessarily do it. It takes a lot of instincts. Brook Lopez's timing, his vision, and the ability to guard two players, that's a length thing, but also just, keeping his head enough on a swivel to where he's able to deal with a roller and a ball handler, and he's able to move back to the other, and then the help can come in for whoever he's not going with. It's just not. There's a big learning curve to that. So that's the scheme the Bucks have run for years, and it's been great. If Doc doesn't want to run that as much anymore, okay. I mean, he's not Mike Budenholzer, but then and then maybe in that instance you have you find another center who can execute in that scheme that Doc wants, especially if they're coming out and hedging more or something like that, or blitzing, as we saw Bobby Portis do. But you're going to have to change what you do on defense dramatically if you're moving on from Brook Lopez. You have to basically abandon what worked for you for many years.
It's a complicated conversation with Brook. I think all three of us are aligned, and we've tried to stress the importance that he has. And it's not the best comp, but I just go back to a lot of times if we're watching a football game and you see a touchdown and you see a guy was wide open, your inclination is to blame the cornerback and what happened there? He got burned, when you just don't know. Was it a zone? What type of coverage was it? What was his assignment? It's very similar with this as well, when you can look at Brook Lopez, especially in the first half of the season, when we would see him constantly under attack and guys with that little floater scoring off of him. And it's, Brook is washed and he's lost a step and he's not the same guy, when everything around him has changed defensively. In a defense that was set up to, okay, we're going to hold our own, and our assignment is to push everything into Brook.
Led the league in shots defended this year.
And it was the same number. It was close. It was more than a year ago, but last year it was by design, or 2 years ago it was by design. This year it was basically the perimeter was an open door and Brook Lopez was constantly under attack.
Yeah.
As we begin to wrap up here, so we've touched on the second apron. We've touched on the draft and what's going to make this interesting for financial reasons. I don't know that we've fully aligned on what we think to expect in the offseason. That I think at the start of it, as we were talking about, you kind of talked yourself into, well, it was a year of change, and it was a coaching change and another coaching change and Damian Lillard. So you can look at this as keep the group as is, year 2 under Doc. We feel like we'll be better next year. I think the difficulty with that, as Camille and I have touched on, I know you guys have mentioned it on Brew Hoop as well, is, I mean, it's 2 straight years of the same result. That at one point, does it start becoming an excuse to say, well, this happened and Giannis wasn't healthy? That's the one piece, while you can talk me into all the rest, that kind of leads me to believe this is not going to be a status quo season for all intents and purposes, off season. That, I think, of the names we mentioned, I would not be surprised if we saw multiple moved, where it's one move to set something else up to get you under that second apron, then you make another move. That I do think, you have Damian Lillard, and everything we've heard from Dame, he's going to be in a much better spot with everything coming into this next season. What you saw from Chris in the playoffs, the fact that you didn't see Giannis again, but as Camille and I talked about, just seeing Damian Lillard and how he played when healthy in that series, seeing what Chris Middleton did, that gave you part of the equation of, okay, this does make sense. When these guys are healthy, we got to fill in the gaps around them.
Yeah, I think all this offseason, what I've said is just about getting the middle of the roster right. I think you have answers on either end, your star talent and like some young players who maybe have some future with the team, but aren't quite at the level of a starter, a high quality role player. And yeah, I think one thing we know about John Horst, and I don't think people maybe fully appreciate it, but he's never really sat on his hands. Yeah. Obviously, last offseason, the first round exit was he pounces for Dame Lillard. Major trade happened right before the season, kind of set up just a bit of a difficult transition for everybody involved, just because the expectations completely changed. But moreover, I think this offseason, I compare it a little bit more to the 2020 offseason, which was like what you got right in between the bubble and when the season started in December. Of course, that was the Bucks championship season, but they really overturned the roster that offseason. I forget the exact numbers, but
half of the roster was new.
Yeah, and similarly, the previous roster was also kind of old. You looked at the roster you saw in the bubble, George Hill, Ersan, love me some Ersan, Robin Lopez, Wesley Matthews, Kyle Korver, Marvin Williams. These were all guys who were they were over, I think they were probably all over 34 at that point. Maybe not Matthews or Hill, but they were very close. It was an older roster, and then I think I'd have to look back, but I thought I remember seeing something. It's like they had an older roster that year, or at least the age of players that they sent out. If you were to average them all up, that offseason was kind of older, and they went into the offseason. Obviously, the Drew Holiday trade completely reshaped the franchise. They go into free agency. They sign DJ Augustine. That wasn't so great, but they were able to trade him for PJ Tucker, Bobby Portis on the biannual exception, and let's see who else was. I don't think there was any other real veterans they signed.
Torrey Craig was the other guy that they brought in, but again traded him early in it. Bryn Forbes. And
that's
of course when you comp the 2 years too. Yeah, it was 7 guys they had the year prior that had 10 or more years of service in the league, and the following year it was 4, but 2 of those were Jeff Teague, and who was
they didn't come along until later.
And then DJ Augustine, who you traded to get PJ Tucker.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up Forbes because I forgot about him. He was actually on that. He was a guy they signed a little bit higher than the minimum, using part of the mid-level exception. So they've had some success with that. The little mid-level, as you sometimes call it, in years past. They brought in George Hill the following offseason on that. You can sometimes split that up. It's harder now because the value has decreased a little bit. And it's gotten to the point now where what a player, if you were to split that between two players at 5.2 million, what one or both of those players is going to make is probably not much higher than his minimum salary. So it's not worth it to do it for the team or for the player. But back to the original point we were making. Yeah, I think revamping that roster creatively, that was obviously a big masterstroke for Horst the offseason that got them a championship. But what the Bucks really need to do when looking, in the free agent market is we've talked about this guy in a completely different light, but they need to be looking, I think, for at least one player who's like Pat Connaughton was in 2018, who came off his rookie deal he was a second round pick, so it wasn't a very long rookie deal in Portland. Looked like, had some flashes of being a decent role player. And the Bucks really developed him. I think, for all the hand wringing about the Bucks not having a lot of young players over the last 5 years, I mean, they've only had 2 first round picks since 2018. And, one of them's not with the team. They helped develop him, I'd say, pretty well. But what the Bucks are good at is, I think, developing guys kind of on that second contract, like the young veterans, like Bobby Portis, for example. These were guys who maybe didn't really have, or Javon Carter, guys who didn't really make an impact in the league prior, or were playing on bad teams, weren't really seen as like winning players. That was the Bobby Portis thing. And the Bucks molded them into very high level role players, at least for a stretch. Those days may be behind some of them now, but that's something the Bucks haven't really done in the last couple off seasons. They've gone older. They've gone like with established veterans. The last guy I remember they brought in who was kind of who would fit into that archetype of player, like that kind of career to a T, was Shemi Ojale. That didn't work out. Like I think that, and maybe that ruined it a little bit, that poisoned the well a little bit, where it's like, okay, this is a guy we can develop. Everyone's thinking, hey, this could be the PJ Tucker replacement. They have similar profiles. I think the Bucks need to kind of do that again now, and use that minimum or maybe part of the mid-level, if that's available, on a younger player. And hopefully, they develop like into something, a good role player, and you can roll over that contract a bit, kind of like they did with, Connaughton and Portis, and you can make it into a trade chip, for example, as we're talking about with those contracts now.
Granted, a forgettable trade, but Shemi Ojale was part of a trade within that season. And that, to the point that we mentioned, another area where John Horst deserves credit. Not only Camille and I have talked about this, but getting moves done where you thought there was just no avenue or resources for the Bucks to do it. The Holiday deal, it made sense. Everybody mentioned that name all throughout the offseason and end of that season. Go get Drew Holiday. We all signed off on it. You just thought, I just don't know how the Bucks could do this. Same with Damian Lillard, obviously. So he deserves credit there, and also deserves credit with the other names you mentioned of DJ Augustine. It's not working out. We'll turn 2 DJs into a PJ, and same with Shemi Ojale, and some of those. Rodney Hood was part of that deal too. Of this didn't work. Let's trade him as well. So he does deserve credit there. And it's going to be interesting to see what John Horst is able to do this offseason. But I think it's a good point, a very good comparison to go back to what they did in not the summer, but the late fall, early, not quite winter,
November, December,
when they reshaped basically the bench and the middle part of the roster is what you're looking to do again when you have, we think, Damian Lillard, Giannis, and Chris Middleton on the roster. A lot of good stuff here, Van, and I know you've tweeted it out as well, all the details around the second apron. So if this didn't clear anything up, I would say contact Van on Twitter as well, or look at any of the tweets that he has put out about the Bucks situation, as that has been the place that we have gone to come up to speed on a lot of this. Do you guys have anything special planned for draft night at Brew Hoop?
It's in the works right now. We're going to do, I know you two are doing a live stream, so sorry to, sorry that we're going to be, competing with you in the same time slot. But we're going to try to do a live stream. We set up something, SB Nation, our parent network, partnered with a new kind of startup recently towards the end of last year called Playback, where
Playback's cool. Yeah.
Okay, so you two are familiar. Basically, it's like it's kind of like
it's like a watch along,
the Manning cast,
Yeah.
sort of what they did for Monday Night Football. We did them for the playoff games, where like people can tune in and watch using their League Pass subscription, or we also can get in some people without a subscription. They can watch the game with some of us from Brew Hoop, but we brought in some special guests. We brought in Jim Paschke. We brought in Brian Sampson, who you two know, of course. Frank for one of the games too. So yeah, I'm working. I am working on someone to join us on draft night. But I will be joined. I think I'll do it. We will be joined live from Fiserv by Gabe Stoltz. Once the pick is made, and when there's a presser and everything, we'll have him on for some live reaction. But otherwise, it'll be me and Jackson Gross, who's one of our other contributors, who's a great draft resource, great talent evaluator. I would encourage you, Camille, especially to read his piece on Tyler Kolek the other day if you haven't already. It was good. Okay, good. It was a fun read. I really enjoyed that one. So that's what
the more the merrier with all the Bucks content that is out there, especially when we think back to you guys at Brew Hoop were the pioneers. Basically, that was it. That was out there. You knew you weren't going to get it. And Charles Gardner and company at the Journal Sentinel, but you knew you weren't getting it nationally. Yeah, Bucksketball as well.
R.I.P. Bucksketball. That was a good one.
Yeah.
But really good to catch up with you, and hopefully we cleared up a lot of questions and set the table for what is, as we've kind of gone back and forth. I think we're all aligned. It's going to be a pretty busy offseason for the Bucks, and I don't think it's just going to be one move that is made by this team.
Yeah, seems like it's going to be multiple moves. Multiple moves.
Yeah, I really don't think they're going to sit on their hands. Yeah.
Well, that's what we have going on for the rest of the week. As Van mentioned as well, they're doing a live stream. Camille and I are going to do, we still haven't hammered out the time yet that we're going to do it. But we are going to do some component of a live show during night one of the NBA draft. We think we're going to have Frank on the following day to get his thoughts, recap that as well. And then maybe we're talking about a trade that has already been made by the Bucks on night one of the NBA draft. But appreciate everybody for tuning in to this extensive conversation, and to Van as well for giving us the time today to knock this one out. For Camille and Van, I am Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.